So what is going on, everyone? Fernando Silva here with another video, and today we're actually going to skip on the iPad stuff and talk about the MacBook Air, that M1 Macbook Air that released in November of 2020. I got it on release day and I've been using it every single day since then, and I wanted to give you guys my long-term review and thoughts on this M1 Macbook Air, especially from an iPad user's perspective, because like I said, I use it every single day, and it might not be for the YouTube stuff, but I still use it every single day, and I wanted to give you guys my thoughts. So let's get into it. So let's actually start this video by talking about which MacBook Air I have. So I have the baseline model, the 8GB of RAM and the 256GB of storage, absolute baseline model. And the reason I went with that one is because A, Apple touted that the M1 processor was gonna, break Moore's Law 10 times, and the M1 processor alone will be enough to run everything that you need. For the most part, that's been true. And then also the reason I got it is because, again, I do most of my stuff on the iPad, but I still needed a desktop operating system to get some other activities and other tasks done on this MacBook Air, and that's the reason why I just went with the baseline model, right? 8GB RAM, 256GB of storage. I figured I don't really use a lot of actual internal storage space, everything's in the cloud, and then the 8GB of RAM paired with the M1 processor, especially when Apple was hyping it up so much, I figured that's gonna be plenty for what I'm gonna be using it for. And one little tip that I do want to give you guys, especially when you're buying any, big ticket Apple product, go through the education store. I know that it's definitely available in the US and probably in the UK and Canada. I don't know about the rest of the world, but in the US version of the Apple Store, you get $100 off any product or a free pair of headphones like AirPods or Beats. It just depends on what time of year they're doing the promotion. So this MacBook Air actually cost me $900 through the Apple Store, and they ask for zero verification if you're, an educator or a student or anything like that, especially if you order it online. Maybe in store they might ask you for a student ID or like a professor ID, but online, the checkout process is exactly the same, saves you $100. So you're welcome. So now let's quickly talk about the design of the MacBook Air. So the MacBook Air, we have this tried and true kind of design language, the aluminum body, cold to the touch, very, very clean, has a tapered edge where it gets thinner as you get closer to the end of the laptop. And, Apple's had this kind of aesthetic for, I think, since 2008, when the MacBook Air, the first one released, coming out of that manila envelope. I think it was 2008, or it could be 2011, I could be wrong. But anyway, they've kept that same design language, and again, Apple products, they're pristine, they're very well built, the keyboard itself is amazing, even though I don't really use the keyboard too much because, as you guys can see, I just kind of plop it up there, connect it to a USB-C port, and then use Bluetooth peripherals like a Satechi keyboard and then my Logitech mouse. So I don't really use the keyboard too much. And again, I use my MacBook Air as a desktop computer. I rarely bring it with me anywhere. When I do have to do stuff on the go, even if it is for work, I bring my iPad because I figure if I'm on the go, all I'm gonna need is my iPad. But then to keep going with the design, honestly, the trackpad is probably top in class. You see companies like Microsoft and Lenovo and HP. All these companies are now copying Apple's aesthetic of a giant trackpad. I remember in the beginning people were like, oh, I hate the giant trackpad because of my accidental palm touches. But come on, guys. We want as much trackpad real estate as possible, and that MacBook Air is no slouch. So you have plenty of real estate when it comes to the trackpad, and I use the trackpad mostly for gesture-based controls, like swiping up with 4 fingers to get a view of all my applications, but outside of that, I kind of just stick to my Bluetooth peripherals, because like I said, I just put it up, use it as a secondary display, and do most of my work through my BenQ monitor behind me. And then in terms of ports on the actual MacBook Air, you get 2 USB-C ports, and I believe they're also Thunderbolt ports, and again, that's all you really get. And then on the right side of the MacBook, you get a headphone jack, a 3.5mm headphone jack, and that's it when it comes to ports. There's no SD card slot, no HDMI port, there's no more USB-C ports on the right side, so the only option that you have if you're going with the M1 Max is 2 USB-C Thunderbolt 4 ports on the left-hand side. Now that might change come October 18th when Apple is about to release these M1Xs, but for right now, if you're going with the M1 processor, you can only get 2 USB-C/Thunderbolt ports. And then the biggest difference between the Air and the actual MacBook Pro with the M1 processor is that the Pro has a built-in fan versus the MacBook Air doesn't. So this thing runs completely silent. It's never gotten hot for me. It's never gotten warm. I've never heard anything get turned on because again, there's no fan to get turned on in there versus the MacBook Pro, it does. And then the MacBook Pro does have that touch bar on the top, which, to each their own. A lot of people hate it, a lot of people love it. I never really used it. I did have it on a 15-inch MacBook Pro from 2016. And I used it whenever I needed to up the brightness and stuff like that, but I'm fine with physical buttons. So now let's actually talk about what I use this MacBook Air for, because again, it's a $900 MacBook Air with the M1 processor and only 8GB of RAM. So 8GB of RAM, I remember I had the Intel version, the 2019 Intel version with 16GB of RAM MacBook Air, and that computer could not run anything. That computer was so bad in terms of RAM management, being able to open up applications. I hated using it. But then move over to this M1 with 8GB of RAM, it's a completely different story. So the main things that I use this MacBook Air for are Microsoft suite of products, so PowerPoint, Excel, Word, things like that. Then I'm also in the Google Workspaces now that they've changed those names to Google Docs. So Google Docs and the whole Google Drive suite of applications, I'm always in that. And then pretty much just Safari, iMessage, and things like that. So overall, I've been very happy with the performance, especially even after a year. Battery life is amazing, even though I don't really test out the battery life too much because it's always plugged in. And people do ask me, hey, does leaving your computer plugged in at all times mess up the battery? And it doesn't. You know, Apple's gotten a lot smarter with their smart charging and their trickle charging and making sure you're not pushing as much wattage as possible, especially if you're at like 99 and 100% all the time. So it kind of goes idle when you're fully charged, when you are plugged in. So don't worry about your battery, you know, losing life cycles or losing battery life because of being plugged in all the way. We're now in 2021, going on 2022. Apple has figured out how to manage battery, especially if you're plugged in the entire time. But again, to break down what I use this for, and the only reason why I use it is because it has, again, a desktop class operating system. So I can use a secondary monitor like my BenQ monitor behind me. I can have 7 different PowerPoints open, which is usually what I'm doing, right? I'm grabbing Excel files, I'm grabbing PowerPoint files, I'm manipulating data, I'm transferring data from one PowerPoint over to another, inserting charts from one Excel file into a PowerPoint to present. So those are all the reasons why I needed to get a real secondary monitor support. And unfortunately, iPadOS has yet to give us that. We got kind of close with Shift Screen, but even then, Shift Screen is all web-based, so I can't download Microsoft PowerPoint. I can use it on the web base, but it's really not the same, right? You want to have all these floating windows happening at the same time. And again, in my opinion, the M1 MacBook Air runs Microsoft products better than a Microsoft computer. I remember for one of my first jobs, they gave me a Microsoft computer and I needed to use Microsoft Suite, and everything just took forever to turn on. Everything took forever to load up. Everything took forever to, you know, refresh and things like that. Versus here, you can see with some B-roll that the second you open up these applications, they're running, they're up, and they're good to go, right? So that's what I love about the M1 MacBook Air, especially with M1 optimized applications. They're built to run super snappy, super quickly, and I don't know how much faster you can really get, right? And again, even with 8 gigs of RAM, I'll have 10 to 12 PowerPoints open, I'll have 2 Excel sheets open. Keep in mind, they're not the most intense PowerPoints, you know, I have some media files in there and things like that. And then with the Excel files, I don't have huge databases and I'm not using pivot tables, you know, very simple charts, you know, forecasting, things like that. So everything runs very, very smoothly. And at the same time, I can have a video playing, I have Spotify open, playing a podcast, you know, I'm answering comments on the YouTube channel with Chrome. But overall, I've been extremely happy with the MacBook Air. I've had 0 issues with it, 0 hiccups, 0 performance issues. I've never had to like restart the actual MacBook Air. If anything, I'd like never turn it off. I never close it. I never take it off the plug. So again, those are all like not the best practices to get longevity out of these MacBook Airs, but that's just how I use my products, right? That's how I use my Apple products. They're built to be used at all times, and the M1 chip really, really does help out. So if you're still using an Intel-based MacBook, I would highly consider going into the M1 realm because Apple's really learned how to optimize, especially on their native applications. And obviously the user base is so big that all these third-party companies like Microsoft, right, like Google, they're building M1 optimized apps because they want to keep those users using their products, right? Because if Microsoft decides not to make an M1 optimized application like Outlook or PowerPoint, they're going to lose people and they're going to switch over to, you know, Apple's Pages and Keynote and things like that, which is not, honestly, it's not as good as PowerPoint. Or maybe it's not that it's not as good, but it's just a lot of the professional world still uses PowerPoint. So you have to be able to work within that ecosystem and in that world, even if you are on a Mac. So again, overall, Apple's done a great job at optimizing the M1 MacBook Air, especially at such a low price point, right? $900 for this M1 MacBook Air where you can run literally everything, right? You can run everything that you would ever want on this MacBook Air with 0 issues. And then I do want to mention a little bit about like video editing and render speeds and things like that, because I know a lot of people use a MacBook Air for that, right? So if you're on Final Cut Pro, everything will be amazing. I know that I had a buddy that was using Adobe Premiere on the 8GB version. He had a little bit of trouble. He ended up returning that one and getting the 16GB version, and then it worked perfectly fine. Even though Adobe Premiere is now optimized for the M1, maybe it just requires a lot more RAM management, a lot more RAM power to get used. But if you're sticking within Apple's native ecosystem, inside of Apple's native applications, you're gonna have 0 issues with those 8GB of RAM. Maybe up your storage a little bit. I should have gone with maybe the 512, but again, I don't really save anything on my MacBook Air. I keep everything in the cloud and try to keep it as empty as possible. But again, I do most of my video editing on the M1 iPad Pro. I mean, I have downloaded things like LumaFusion and iPad-specific apps just to test out on the MacBook Air, and it works. One thing that Apple did do with these M1 and MacBook Airs is that now that they have the M1 chip and the iPad has the M1 chip, you're not going to have iOS and iPadOS apps on the actual MacBook Air. You can download them and use them, but you are constricted to that view. And then also, you know, a lot of those applications are built for touch first, and this doesn't have a touchscreen. So yeah, LumaFusion works, but it's a little bit weird. You gotta like double click a couple things because it's so used to using your fingers input and things like that. So kind of, I would say stick to the Mac dedicated applications. Don't buy a MacBook Air thinking it's going to also be your iPad because it can run iPad apps. Yeah, it can run the iPad apps, but again, they're iPad apps, they're not MacBook apps. Just letting you guys know. So to kind of wrap up this video, all in all, I honestly, for the most part, people do come to me and they ask me, hey, should I get an iPad? Hey, should I get a MacBook? Hey, I'm a student, I really want to go all in on the iPad, but I don't really know, should I just get a MacBook Air? For most people, if you're going to choose one device and that's going to be like your computer and your workhorse and you don't want any learning curve, get a MacBook Air. It's cheaper, it comes with a built-in keyboard and trackpad already, it has Mac OS, it's familiar, especially if you're coming from Windows 10 or Windows 11, it's going to be more familiar than using something like iPad OS, because iPad OS has a little bit of learning curve. You got to make sure that your applications work, or at least your main applications that you use, you got to make sure they're available on iPad OS before doing anything, versus on Mac OS, you know your stuff is going to work for the most part, right? Because it's still a desktop class computer versus iPad OS doesn't really know what the hell it wants to be. So all in all, as an iPad user, I do love the MacBook Air. I still use my iPad for 95% of my things, but when it comes down to having floating windows, when it comes down to needing to manipulate things from 7 different applications, 5 different applications, you got to go with a regular desktop class computer because, again, it's just impossible to do that on iPad OS when you go with more than 3 things at once. But that's going to do for this video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. That was just my perspective on, you know, an iPad first user using the MacBook Air, the M1 Macbook Air for, I want to say almost a year now at this point. And, you know, I'm going to hold on to this for as long as I can. You know, I could see getting 5 to 7 years out of this thing. It's not slowing down. It's getting all the updates. And knowing Apple's going to continue to get software updates and security updates. And it's just hard to complain about such a well-priced and, you know, capable computer. But that's going to do it for this video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and then let me know down below, are you guys going to get any of those new M1X MacBooks that are going to come out? I do believe they're going to release more higher-end M1 MacBooks as opposed to just revamping, you know, the cheap MacBook Airs, because I think that's what we're looking towards. We're going to get like a 14 and a 16-inch M1 MacBook Pro. But let's see what Apple does on October 18th. Definitely stay tuned on the channel to find out more. We got more videos coming, especially we're going to be giving away some Paperlike stuff pretty soon. So stay subscribed.